You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host, author, and occasional misanthrope, Juliette Miranda. Go to theunwritablerant.com and you can subscribe on iTunes or connect with the show on Facebook and Twitter.
Hey there, y'all. This is Juliette Miranda. You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast, episode 103. I hope y'all are in the mood to drink because I know I am. So what do you say? Grab a glass, fill it up, and let's say cheers. Whoa. Oh, y'all, I have a very potent bourbon in my hands right now. Actually, correction, this is a whiskey. Today, I am drinking Barrell Whiskey Batch 01. I've had Barrell Whiskey before. I had their Batch 11, and I think I had Batch number 6, and I've loved what I've had from them so far. Now, a little bit of background about Barrell. They do blend their whiskeys, and this one is a mix of 7- and 8-year aged whiskeys. The mash bill includes corn, rye, and malted barley. This whiskey comes in at a whopping 122 proof. And I'll tell you right up front, that bite hits you. There is a lot more alcohol in this than I anticipated. Once you get past that initial burn, there are a whole lot of big flavors here. It's really full and rich. And right up front, you're going to get a lot of notes of fruit. Apple, maybe a little bit of plum, and definitely cinnamon. Now for me, I really need to kind of work to taste the more sweeter, smoother flavors in this. They're not that easy to pick out. And I think it's because of that really high proof. A little bit of ice, I think, would smooth this out tremendously. And it would probably bring out some of the butterscotch that I'm tasting at the back end. This is not a bad whiskey, but it's not my preference. Really, I prefer Barrell Whiskey Batch 11. That one was way more nuanced, and it just had this bright, lively sort of flavor that I'm not getting out of this first one here. But will that stop me from drinking it on this episode? No. And I'll tell you, this higher proof is doing me a little bit of good, because adjusting to life after returning from New Orleans, it's not easy, y'all. Our trip was everything I could have hoped for and more. I mean, it's New Orleans. You can't go wrong, right? Of course, travel does have some trouble from time to time, and I don't mean the kind that I tend to instigate. It's really inevitable. If you fly more than once or twice a year, you will encounter problems, I guarantee it. And my guy and I have experienced it all. Flight delays, canceled flights, rerouted flights, and all of the random issues that can crop up when you're in a new town. On this trip to New Orleans, however, we encountered an entirely new problem that had even us somewhat amazed. Now, we got to New Orleans just fine, and we were able to check in without issue. And our room, totally fine. But it was the balcony where we found we had some issues. So we're standing out there, and we're taking pictures and soaking up the atmosphere for a couple of minutes. But when we were ready to head back into our room, we found that we couldn't. The balcony door was locked. I look at my guy and I'm all, "What did you do?" I mean, it seemed a reasonable accusation because, of course, it wasn't my fault. It turns out, though, neither of us were at fault because there was only one way to lock that door. A deadbolt on the inside. Oddly, this is not the first time I have been locked in or out of something in New Orleans. Something similar happened to me last year in a dive bar bathroom on Rampart Street. It is worth noting here that everything in New Orleans is old. The only new things you're going to find are the bottles your booze comes in. The rest, it's all in varying states of crumble. Which, don't get me wrong, is one of the many reasons that I adore the French Quarter. But it does make life something of a nuisance when it comes time to take care of certain issues, like peeing. Many of the bathrooms in the Quarter aren't located in bars or restaurants at all. They're behind them, in small cottages and courtyards. Actually, now that I think about it, cottage is something of an overstatement. these bathroom facilities are really more like, I don't know, glorified outhouses. The plumbing is temperamental at best. There is rarely light beyond the sun or moonlight filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. Definitely no air circulation. And there are packs of palmetto bugs that congregate in the corners as if this was church. So you can picture it, right? I'm situated there in one of these lovely spots last year. And after the toilet gurgles a response, I attempt to leave the stall, only to find that the latch on the door would not retract. It was another one of those deadbolt-style locks, one that was either so sticky with decades worth of grime or so swollen in the August humidity that it just gave up all function. Initially, I laughed. I mean, you have to laugh when you're confronted with a situation as ridiculous as that. But my humor was immediately replaced by annoyance when I realized that unless someone came in and kicked the door open, and I'll tell you, that didn't seem likely since I was the only woman in the bar, my only two choices in busting out of that stall included belly crawling under the door or climbing on the toilet and scaling the wall. Now, y'all, I've mentioned this before, but I'm not much of an athlete. So as much as I desperately wanted to avoid putting my skin anywhere near that skanky, oozing floor, I knew that any attempt to even consider pitching myself overboard would result in a reenactment of a Life Alert commercial. The floor it was, and I am pretty sure it was moving just as much as I was as I shimmied myself across it. I emerged from my toilet cell covered in filth and bug particles, and likely some form of bubonic plague. And wouldn't you know it, when I rattled that bathroom door stall from the other side, it popped right open. Now, escaping that bathroom was vile and disgusting, but clearly not impossible. Trying to find our way off of a third-floor balcony presented us with a whole new set of challenges. Not the least of which was, what the fuck do we do now? There certainly wasn't going to be any climbing over the iron grates, that's for damn sure. My guy grabbed his cell phone and instructed that useless horse Siri to call the hotel front desk. She responded by searching for boat rentals. I don't know why my guy insists on using Siri. The two have a more strained relationship than I do with my ex-boyfriends. It's borderline abusive at this point. She doesn't listen, my guy gets frustrated, and the two sit there and taunt each other until someone is forced to reboot. My guy was clearly on the verge of hurling his phone across the French Quarter, and I was not interested in spending the next 4 days on that balcony. So I took matters into my own hands. New Orleans is my adopted home, after all, and if anyone was going to get us out of this mess, it was going to have to be me. I start looking around. To my left, there is no one. The sidewalk is completely empty. There's no one out on the balconies. It's just us. But then I look to my right, and there, on the corner of Royal and St. Louis streets, was a restaurant Barker. These fellows are situated in front of many of the quarter restaurants, menu in hand and ready to hawk the delicious food inside to anybody who walks past them. Some of these guys are a bit like the carnies of the restaurant world, and this particular gentleman was just as shrewd. I catch his attention with a yell and a wave. He sees me, waves back, and says, "How's the weather up there, y'all?" Well, I yell out our situation, and he starts laughing his ass off. "How are y'all going to come and eat our tasty gumbo if y'all are stuck up there?" he says. Clearly, this guy subscribes to the always be selling philosophy. Meanwhile, in the background, I hear my guy yelling, No, do not search for motor vehicle registration, you piece of shit." I don't think my guy was going to be any help in our hostage negotiations with the food Barker. So fine, I got this. I turn back to the Barker. I tell you what, I say. You go tell the bellman that we're up here, and we'll stop by for a drink. The guy scratches his chin, because he clearly knows that he's in a position of power. And it doesn't help, of course, that my guy is in the background, over-enunciating hotel lobby at the top of his lungs as if he's talking to a belligerent 3-year-old. I look down at the barker waiting for his answer. "No," he says, "y'all need to come by for a drink and some of our gumbo." My guy answers for me by yelling to his useless phone assistant, "What the fuck is a Carpy?" I shrug my shoulders at the barker. We could go on like this for hours, but I'm anxious to hit the streets, and really, I'll eat gumbo all day long if you let me. So I yell out, "You got yourself a deal, buddy." He jogs across the street and grabs the bellman from the entrance. They both come out, and the barker points up at the balcony, where I'm waiting patiently, and my guy is beating his head against the wall while his phone reboots. It's not long before the bellman has a service guy run up to our room to free us from captivity. The guy is, quite honestly, baffled at how our door managed to lock itself. He writes it off as being a quirk of an old building, and my guy and I laugh and make our way out into the street to honor our deal with the restaurant barker. Siri stayed put in the room to think about what she'd done. Now, I told both of these lockout stories to several people we met in New Orleans, and all of them attributed the experiences to poltergeist. Really, y'all, I'm not entirely inclined to agree with that assessment. Not because I don't think it's possible. It's just that I like to believe if there was a playful poltergeist in our hotel room, it would have had the courtesy to lock us out on the balcony, not to prevent our stay, but to prevent us from leaving. And with that, I'm raising up my glass and drinking to New Orleans, and thanks for such a fabulous time. Whew. All right. This whiskey has one hell of a kick, I'm telling y'all. Won't be long before I'm drunk. Which actually is something that you encounter when you are in New Orleans. Doesn't really matter where you are. People everywhere are drunk. There are, of course, varying stages of being drunk. Some people are better at it than others. I've learned a thing or two about moderation, about maintaining a buzz over several hours, but it is a learned skill. It's not something that you know how to implicitly do. That's why I always feel just the slightest twinge of sympathy when I see a 20-something who has overindulged. They're hard to miss at bars. They're usually being let off by a sympathetic friend to barf it out in the bathroom. And in New Orleans, especially on Bourbon Street, you can often find them passed out on doorsteps while their unsympathetic friends continue the party. That's not to say I condone binge drinking, but it is only through trial and error that you learn what you like and what your limits are. That's how I learned. The memory of my very first true, horribly drunk experience is more than enough of a deterrent to keep me from drinking to excess now. Alcohol has always been a part of my life. Since infancy, really, when, on the advice of my pediatrician of all people, my parents used to rub whiskey on my gums when I was teething. From there, wine or champagne was served at every festive event, and my dad used to let me sneak sips of his evening cognac. So it's not as though booze was any great mystery to me as a teenager, but that was in a controlled environment with my parents keeping close watch. When it became available to me at a party with my friends, well, I took full advantage of that freedom. I was just shy of 17 and spending the night with my friend Colleen. Her parents were away for the weekend, and like all great teenage fuck-up stories go, her older brother decided to host a party. And I had a massive crush on that guy. He epitomized all of my teenage rock and roll fantasies. A dumb, skinny, moody kind of guy who quoted hair metal songs as if they were poetry. He had never really shown much interest in me up until then, so I figured that this party would be my great chance to wow him with my wit and snare him with my sexy jailbait style. And booze was gonna be the key. Not that anyone knew anything about good booze then, of course. The thrill was in drinking, not drinking well, and this party's main libation was old-style beer. I have no idea if old-style ever reached national status, but it was a Midwest staple back then, renowned for its distinctive lack of flavor to get in the way of the alcohol. It was, simply put, swill. And it was in abundance. That was the thing, y'all. This party was my first time truly left to my own devices, where I didn't have to worry about a curfew or how to get home or any of my other typical reservations. So when that plastic cup of shitty piss beer was handed to me, I drank. I drank with the reckless abandon that only the naive know. And for an hour or so, it was amazing. For that first hour, I danced. I flirted. I chatted with everyone as though they were all my best friends. Booze was my great liberator, helping me to shed my snarky reservation and become some semblance of charming. But Colleen's brother still hadn't paid me much attention, so after hour 2, I decided I needed to up my flirting game. The problem with those rock and roll poet types like him was that you needed an in, something that demonstrated you were on the same wavelength. Something that showed you understood the depth of their so-called feelings. I had already tried dropping a few lyrics of Motley Crue's Home Sweet Home into conversation, but it had no effect. It was going to take a much bigger gesture to get his attention. Over the course of 2, 3, 9 more beers and maybe 1 beer bong, I contemplated the situation. And despite my increasing drunkenness and complete lack of reason, what seemed like a perfectly logical answer hit me. I'd get the brothers' attention with Butterbean. Butterbean was an 8-foot-long albino Burmese python. Colleen's dad kept him in a large tank in the basement. I'd played with him dozens of times before, and despite being something of a behemoth, that snake was, as far as I knew, completely docile. I mean, really, who doesn't like a chick with a snake? My plan was to coax Butterbean out of his tank, drape him over my shoulders like a stole, and parade my drunken ass out into the fray, preferably to the tune of Warrant's Cherry Pie. I'd writhe around a bit to thunderous applause, bewitching the brother with my mastery of the animal kingdom, and lead him off to the sofa in the basement for a little bit of making out. What could possibly go wrong with that plan? Well, for starters, I hadn't counted on Butterbean being so fucking heavy, or so reluctant to leave his tank. I slid the door open. I had hoped Butterbean would just hop right out, excited to take a little stroll with me, but all he wanted to do was lay there in a clump and poke his lazy head out and blink at me. Mind you, I knew nothing about snakes. The fact that Butterbean could latch his jaw onto my neck never occurred to me once in my beer-soaked condition. So I saw no real reason to not grab a hold of his scaly girth and attempt to drag that poor snake out of his enclosure. Have you ever tried to manhandle a python? I don't recommend it. Every inch of that thing was seething and heavy and impossible to get any sort of grip on. I'm dragging and yanking on the massive beast, and the whole while I'm cooing nonsense like, "Come on, Beanie, just work with me." I finally managed to tug him onto the floor, where he just sort of lays, half-coiled and half-heartedly slithering toward the door and staring at me as if to say, "What now, drunkie?" I took another swig of beer and got down on the ground with him. I'm drunkenly trying to reason with the snake now, hoping that my slurred words might make sense to the reptile. I wrapped my arms around him, halfway between his head and tail, and with the weird superhero-like strength that can only be achieved through hours of boozing and the surge of raging teenage hormones, I hoist that sucker onto my shoulders like a cave woman. My first attempt to stand did not go so well. My balance was off to begin with, and now that the alcohol was really coursing through my system, it was something of a challenge to try and stand up with what had to be at least 50 pounds of snake coiled around me. Thank the Lord for all those ballet lessons my mom made me take, because on my next try, I was able to get full upright and situate that snake around me like a slinky. And at first, it really wasn't that bad. Butterbean was reasonably accommodating to my stupid antics, and he hung on to me kind of like a large tube sock stuffed with wet cement. But as I made my way up the basement stairs to make my grand sexy entrance, he started to get a little anxious. And here's the thing that nobody will ever tell you about wearing a snake. Those jerks will fuck up your hair. Between the weight of Butterbean writhing around on my long hair and him trying to tuck his head into it, what had started out as a gorgeous masterpiece of tawny Katea and 80s-style hair brilliance turned into something of a morning-after disaster. But no matter. I was sure that the very sight of me and Butterbean would be the height of everyone's rock and roll fantasies. I push the door open just as one song ends and Whitesnake's Still of the Night kicks in. If I wasn't entirely confident or sure of myself, and if Butterbean may have coiled himself around me just the slightest bit tighter, I didn't let on. I sashayed myself right up to the brother. I grabbed his head and planted a really sloppy kiss somewhere in the vicinity of his mouth. And then, as a grand finale gesture, I grabbed the cup out of his hands and knocked the entire drink back in one seriously unsexy gulp. I had expected that he would be drinking that swilly beer like everyone else, but that wasn't beer in that cup. It was orange juice and Everclear. Y'all, I don't think there is a worse combination of booze on this planet than the 12 or so cans of old style I'd put back, and that layer of nasty, acidic fruit juice and grain alcohol I topped it with. Oh, I'll tell ya, I would have thrown up. I absolutely would have covered that entire room with orange beer vomit. But I couldn't. Maybe it was the noise. Maybe it was all the drunk teenagers in the room. But Butterbean wasn't having it. He took one look at the chaos around him and did what snakes do when they feel threatened. He attacked. I was his easy target, of course, seeing as how he was wrapped around my supple body. And that fucker started gleefully tightening himself around me so much I could barely breathe, let alone barf. And it was right about this time when all of the alcohol that I had had to drink over the past 3 hours hit that horrible, terrible apex where your only options are violent vomiting, passing out, or both. This presented the partygoers with 2 problems. Me, on the verge of total blackout, and Butterbean, on the verge of unhinging his jaw and having me for dinner. And I'll tell you, I have no doubt that those asshat teenagers would have been more than willing to let one problem solve the other. And I say that because no one moved. Clearly, I had completely ruined the party's collective drunk, and no one seemed entirely sure about what to do next. You gotta remember, this was pre-cell phone and pre-internet. The closest thing anyone had for emergency reference was a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas and a bunch of National Geographic magazines that had been dog-eared to the pictures of naked women. Meanwhile, I am engulfed in the world's tightest reptile hug. All I can hear now is Butterbean's angry hissing. I'm thinking, this is it. This is how I'm gonna go. But thankfully, someone emerges from the party coma and runs up to me to take control of the situation. Instructions are yelled, hands start gripping me, and Butterbean is slowly unwound from me from the bottom up. The second I'm able to take a full breath of air, full-on nausea hits me and the room starts to spin. My arm is grabbed, and I am quickly pulled off toward the bathroom and shoved in the general direction of the toilet. We spent the rest of the night there. That is how appallingly sick I was. I seeped back and forth into consciousness, only vaguely aware that someone was holding my hair, wiping my face, and occasionally responding to pounds on the door with things like, "Pee outside, you fucking animals!" I woke up the next morning with a towel under my face, horrendous bruising on my arms, and the revolting taste of stale beer and acid in my mouth. I look around and see that the bathroom door has been jammed shut with a broomstick. And there, sleeping on a pile of towels in the bathtub, was a girl that I had never seen before. A drop-dead, gorgeous blonde whom I could only assume had been my savior the night before. She wakes up as I'm trying my best to wash up and smiles. That would have been a nice trick if the snake hadn't tried to murder you, she says. She steps out of the tub then, grinning as if it's the most natural thing in the world for a 17-year-old girl to do on a Sunday morning, reaches out her hand and introduces herself. Y'all, that bathtub blonde? Yep, that was Crazy Town. And now, y'all, I'm going to raise up my glass and drink to Butterbean, the albino Burmese python, whom I am happy to report survived the night just fine and made it back to his happy pen. Whew, all right. This whiskey is certainly working its wonders on me. Now, before I wrap things up, I just want to mention that I am doing something very cool in New Orleans in 2018. I am so excited to be a part of the Podern Love 2018 conference. It's a podcast convention for listeners by listeners, and I'm going to be there. If you want to find out more about this incredibly cool conference, just look up Podern Love on Facebook or @PodernLove on Twitter and learn all the details about how you and I and a whole bunch of other great podcasts can hang out in New Orleans. You know you want to do this. And now, I think I'm going to finish off my whiskey and go find a little bit more trouble to get into. I'll be back to chat with y'all next Sunday. Until then, cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablерant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter @MorningNeurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton relay. Hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.